Okay, good evening everyone. Good to see you all. Welcome to our second session. To begin with, I'm just going to recap very, very briefly on what we covered in the first session. In particular, we started off by looking at world issues over the last 10 years, and in particular, sort of changes that have happened, fundamental changes that have happened in the world over the last 10 years. We looked at the population, how the population was increasing. We looked at globalization, the rise of China in particular as the main factory house of the world, and how the influence of China has shifted economies across the world. We looked at terrorism, how that has changed, particularly in the last 10 years after 9/11, how terrorism has now become on the world stage. It's not a localized problem anymore. The terrorists, after 9/11, it was realized, had the possibility and also the potential to cause mass destruction, which got the politicians very worried indeed. That led to wars, invasions in the Middle East, to try and suppress the terrorist problem. We also looked at the economic changes that are going on, the credit crunch we had in 2008, and how that we can no longer ignore what's happening in Wall Street or in China and various other places. It's so interconnected, and that's the fundamental change of our world, mainly in the last 10 years. It's become so interconnected. We can have droughts and problems on one side of the planet, and that affects the cost of our food in the supermarket. We also looked at the technological change that happened in the world, and how there's been a global explosion in communications. And that in itself is very exciting, but has also assisted a fundamental change in the Middle East, where the population of hard-pressed dictator-style countries have been able to use technology to help overthrow their brutal dictators. And since we last met, of course, Libya's Colonel Gaddafi has, in the population's eyes, been dealt with. Okay, we also looked at the Arab Spring. For people interested in Bible prophecy, that has been a major fundamental shift in that area. It's probably the main cause why we're doing this series that we're presenting to you in our seminars, because this has a potential to fulfill many Bible prophecies in this region, and we really want to bring that to your attention. So the people movement, as we've said, managed to overthrow their dictators, and what's going to follow? What is going to follow? That's the big question. Of course, the West would like to see democracy flourish in these regions, but will that happen? And that's a huge if. And a lot of these problems in the Middle East, as we said, are all centered around, in particular, the Israeli-Arab conflict that's been rumbling along for years, that nobody ever seems to find the answers to, and is still very much in our news today. Then Chris spoke about how we can be, without a shadow of a doubt, we can be sure that a lot of the prophecies in the Old Testament were definitely written before the events unfolded. And that was mainly because of the Septuagint translation, where the Old Testament was translated into Greek 132 years before Christ. And we looked at the prophecy about Christ and how there's no shadow of a doubt. History tells us that these verses in the Bible were written long before these events took place. Again, in the Authorized Version, that was 400 years ago, when the New Testament and the Bible was translated into English 400 years ago. So even when we look at the New Testament, which we will do over this series, we can be 100% sure that these verses were written before the events, a long time before the events, and not afterwards. Then we focused it on Israel, and we introduced the fact that God had set Israel up to be his witness. The nation of Israel, through its blessings and its curses, would display the hand of God at work in the world, not only in the past, but also in the future. And one particular event that we focused in on was the regathering of the Jews back in their homeland, which happened in 1948. A major milestone to do with prophecy, because we know it's at that time when they're back in the land that all the prophecies of the Bibles will come to a dramatic conclusion when God intervenes with the world. Okay, what we didn't mention last week was our website. Now, over this series, there's going to be a lot of information coming over to you. And we appreciate if you're new to Bible prophecy, it's very hard to absorb that. So we would really encourage you to go to the website where you can get video clips of our presentations. They're broken into bite-sized pieces, and you can re-familiarize yourself with what we've been talking about, which is particularly useful when you come to the next session, to have it all nice and fresh, ready to go for the next session. So we would encourage you to do that. Okay, Chris.
You might recall last time we explained that we're looking at a stage, the world stage. And all of the things, or at least most of the things that Dave has spoken about, the economic problems and all of these things, are really the backdrop of this stage. They will impact on events to come, but they're not the main event, and that's really important to understand. The main event is actually the two figures there. And those two figures, one represents the Arabs and the other represents the Jews. Very, very important. So what we're going to do this evening, at least this part of the evening, I just want to trace the major players in this drama. Abraham, if you go back into the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, beginning round about chapter 12 and running through to chapter 22 and on, you will find all of these individuals, all of these people listed there, and lots of information about them. So when you've got some time, go and have a look. Abraham had a nephew who was called Lot, and he had a wife called Sarah, and he had another wife. She was sort of a wife called Hagar. Hagar was an Egyptian, and Hagar had a son called Ishmael. And now you're going to recognize some of these names. You almost certainly recognize Abraham, probably Ishmael. And you might, when you listen to the TV news or read newspapers, when Arabic names come up, this name is one of them. Abraham is also an Arabic name. It's usually pronounced Ibrahim, but it's the same man, Abraham. So Ishmael, the son of Hagar, but also the son of Abraham. And Lot had two sons, one called Moab and the other called Ammon. Sarah had Isaac. Also she had Jacob and Esau, twins. Jacob's name was Israel, and Esau is often called Edom or Mount Seir, and that's because of the place where he went to live. Esau married into the family of Ishmael and essentially became part of this group of people who are now in black. Amalek was the grandson of Esau. Israel had 12 sons, and they became the 12 tribes of Israel. Extremely well known, I should imagine. And also among this group here, but not originating from any of these, the Philistines, and these people occupied the Gaza Strip, and it's very much in the news now, isn't it? So, when we look at this group of people here, the ones in red are the Jewish people, okay? And the ones in black are who? The Arab peoples, okay? If you were to ask a Jew, trace your ancestry back and tell me where you began, the Jew would say, he would point back to Abraham. If you were to ask an Arab to trace his ancestry back, he would answer the question in exactly the same way, that his ancestors go back to Abraham or Ibrahim. So from this one man, all of these nations, and we're going to trace them through this evening and demonstrate to you who they are and where they are and what they are doing and the relationship between them both. Now, we have two amazing modern miracles. Dave hinted the first one, and that is, well, he didn't hint actually, it was very powerfully expressed, wasn't it, really? But the return of the Jews. And I want us to understand that this is absolutely awesome. It's the most amazing thing that you can think of. In AD 70, and the job was finished off in AD 35, the Jews were expelled from the land of Israel by the Roman occupation, and they have spent the last couple of centuries, sorry, not centuries, a couple of millennia, traveling through different countries, being persecuted from country to country. But God said many, many times in the Bible that he will bring them back to the very same land from which they were expelled. An astonishing miracle. But the next bit of the miracle is equally astonishing, and that's the rise of the Arab nations. If you were to go back 100 years and try and figure out who these people were, or even where they were, you'd have a great difficulty. But of course, what changed all this was the fact that they found oil underneath the sand, and they became very, very rich and very, very powerful indeed.
So, as we've mentioned this evening, we've learned about Israel being restored in their land. But what about the Arabs? What part do they play then in these final year prophecies that we're so very interested in? Let's look at the Arabs. Right, I've got an animation here that will run across the screen. There's a timeline at the bottom. And here we have the Kingdom of Egypt long ago. This is about 5,000 years ago. Above them we had the Hittite Empire. And then the nation of Israel was born, came up out of Egypt, had God as their leader, and were very, very well blessed until they rejected God. Then the Assyrian Empire grew and overran much of the area, which was then eventually replaced by the Babylonian Empire. The Persian Empire then took control of the empire, of the area. They were followed by the Macedonian Empire. So different empires all the time were taking control. We have the Roman Empire. This is about the time of Jesus now. And the Romans kicked the Jews out of the Promised Land. Then we had the Byzantine Empire. They keep coming. Various empires trying to take control of the region. This is when the Arabs and the Muslims had a real big influence in the area. That was then replaced by the Seljuk Empire. Then we have the Crusader kingdoms, where a lot of the Christians battle with the Arabs. Then we had Saladin's empire. Then the Mongol Empire to the north. And finally, the Ottoman Empire, which was driven by the Turks. And we're now into sort of the 19th century, when European colonialism took over, and it was under the European influence that the area was then broken up into the nations that we see today, where we have Israel, and roughly at the same time as Israel was established, also the Arab countries got their independence as well. And here we go, these are the Arab countries, and the dates are pretty much the same sort of time as Israel in 1948, thereabouts. So at the same time that Israel is back on the stage, also are the Arab nations. And that's no coincidence. That is no coincidence. And we'll realize that as we start now to look at some of the Bible prophecies. So, just to recap, the Ottoman Empire had control of the land. After the First World War, when the European Empire grew, they took control. In fact, it was the British that drove out the Ottomans with the help of the Arabs. And it was the British influence, it was our influence, that helped to govern that area and divide it up into the nation that we see today in the Middle East. So never before, really, had the map of this area of the world changed so dramatically. So at the same time that we've seen Israel re-established in the Middle East, we've also seen this resurgence of the Arab nations. Of course, another catalyst that has driven this transformation that Chris has already hinted to is oil. At the same time that the Arabs had independence, they've struck oil, literally, and lots of it. And they were very successful in building their economies around it. And of course, we know that oil is the lifeblood of economies across the world. And that is why there's so much interest in this area. And the Arabs did very well out of it, didn't they? And I'm sure we've seen some of the amazing buildings and structures that they've built in the desert. And money doesn't seem to be much of an object. So there we are. There is the Arab world as it stands today. And right in the middle of the Middle East, there's little tiny Israel sat in the middle. Now, is it any wonder that this has all happened at the same time? Well, we think it is. We think it is. And we'll demonstrate that this evening.